Some upcoming space games are doing something a little unusual. They're being designed from the cockpit outward again. And if you love genuine spaceship games where you feel like the pilot, then this is very good news indeed. And you're going to want to know about these upcoming games. So I say this because older space games had a very specific feel that's mostly disappeared in the modern era. In games like X-Wing or Free Space 2, you never left the pilot's seat. Every bit of the experience was done through the ship. Targets, shields, weapons, warnings, all of it lived inside the cockpit. And that meant you weren't watching your ship from the outside and you weren't managing it through menus. Instead, you were the pilot, and the ship was the way you experienced that world. So that focus changed everything, how we felt about the game, how we interacted with those games, and combat was often very vivid and very much about situational awareness. You learned to read the tiny indicators, you felt exposed when shields were dropped, and perhaps more importantly, when things went wrong, you didn't simply respawn. It was either game over or you had to finish the mission however you could. Now, I've been keeping an eye on a handful of space games announced for 2026, and surprisingly, several of them are bringing that cockpit-first approach back to the games. And if that sounds interesting to you, please do consider subscribing, as it really helps these types of videos get out to more people. So, modern space games chase a lot of different ideas, and many of them do that extremely well. When flying isn't treated as the core experience, the ship can start to feel like a tool, a vehicle, rather than a place, a main focus of the game. And that's why this next group of upcoming games really stood out to me. They're deliberately rebuilding the whole experience from the cockpit outwards. Remnant Protocol then describes itself as a space flight sim with a somewhat of a strategy layer. But what matters here is how it's trying to sell that moment-to-moment spaceship experience. Now, if you've ever missed that old rhythm from other games at olden times, and even, I guess, with the modern ones such as Elite Dangerous, and you want to see it elsewhere, things such as focusing on sensors, shields under pressure, targets crossing the front of your canopy, this is the kind of experience that usually means that the developers are really building it around the spaceship, and not just around a map or menu on the screen. In other words, what is interesting to me here is the idea of connecting the two different things together. That is, the intensity of a dogfight and the long-term meaning of the war or conflict itself. And that means that the focus is on more than just the mission. It's more than just the text telling you what you need to do, because you need ships, you need alliances, you need to sabotage things, or you need to go and destroy the target. And whilst you're doing this, the cockpit, the experience of the ship itself, is still the main point. It's your way of achieving these things. And if the developers pull this off correctly, if they pull it off well, then it's going to really be able to carry the game. So in Remnant Protocol, you command a galactic rebellion from a hidden base called Sanctuary. And here you manage research, ship constructions, alliances and espionage, whilst also leading intense dogfighting missions against a tyrannical empire. The game itself blends the classic space sim combat with some strategy similar to what you might see in XCOM. It's also being developed for VR as well and traditional screens. And I think the footage here does a really good job of selling that seated cockpit experience. Now, another game here, Blackstar Ranger. This is a great next example because it really does lean hard into presence and workload as well. So here, you're in the seat of an advanced fighter taking on contract missions, and it's explicitly a first person. The game itself also calls out the full HOTAS support, the developers do at least, as well as 6 degrees of freedom on the flight model. The developers also frame the combat as visceral and chaotic, which is exactly the sort of thing you want to hear about if you're looking for that seated, real cockpit experience, being inside the ship and taking on all those enemies. The developers also appear to be talking about very specific things such as learning the systems of the ship and the control of the fighter itself. In other words, learning how to be a pilot of the ship you're given. And that really means that if this game works, if the developers are able to pull it off, it won't be because the game has the biggest universe. Instead, it will be because it nails the sensation of being inside a ship and using that to fight back and learning how to fly, and not just where to activate specific menus or fill specific bars or unlocks. Next up is G-Rebels, and this is definitely a cockpit first, but it's done in a different way because perhaps more so than anything else, it really does focus on speed. Now, there's both VR mode here as well as a regular cockpit screen mode. All of this is done in first person with flight controls, and the game itself focuses on bounty hunting, racing, getting chased by the police and all the rest of it. And you only have to look at the footage here to see that speed really does feel like speed. Might sound stupid just on the surface of it, but they've really given you the opportunity here to inhabit that cockpit in a very fast and a rapid ship. In other words, it seems the developers are really choosing to focus here on tuning those controls and what the ship feels like. And when a developer does something like that, it usually means they understand what makes this fantasy of flying a ship actually work. Rixer takes a slightly different approach. This one is all about 6 degrees of freedom Newtonian space combat. And there's also a lot of G-force simulation, energy simulation and heat management going on here with a load of different ship subsystems. All of these change how your ship behaves moment to moment. Yes, that means you're going to need to develop real skills to actually pilot the ship. It's something we don't see too often nowadays, in the sense that you really need to understand the ship that you're using inside the game. Few other games go into this depth, maybe Star Citizen and Elite Dangerous, not too many others that are available right now. A few others that are perhaps in development, but well, that's the whole point of this video, pointing out those games that are coming that have this focus. It seems to me then that Rixer is trying to make you feel like a pilot through the mechanics of the ship, through a flight model that really does reward you for manoeuvring the ship, your timing and restraint, and just overall understanding the mechanics of how your ship functions. And all of this is built in a way to support the main gameplay, which is set in a procedurally generated sectors of space. There's both single player options here as well as multiplayer modes, and that includes PvP modes if you're into all of that. So yeah, this is clearly very much ship-centric gaming. Next up is the first project, and this is, well, it's a very different type of approach to a similar sort of idea. Here, you do end up with a space simulator that has an accurate solar system at a 1-to-1 scale, and this is always very nice to see. You end up with a unified world here without loading screens, at least that's the idea. I'm looking forward to seeing how that turns out. And a flight simulation space with very close to what they're classing as real physics. In other words, it's not an arcade game, it is very much about flying a real spaceship in the simulation sense. And again, I do feel a lot of this is quite clear in the footage we're seeing on the screen. In fact, that's common throughout all the footage we've seen on the screen, that these ships, these games at least, do appear to be given a very ship-centric focus. And we won't really know until we get our hands on, but that does seem to be the vibe. And for everything that the developers of these games are talking about, they're very much aiming for that. So with First Project, you pilot a near-future spaceship, you mine resources, you fight for control, you trade goods, and engage in other players with other players across a seamless, unified universe, and all done without loading screens like I mentioned. The idea here is that ultimately there'll be thousands of players that can coexist in the same world, and here you'll be forming alliances, waging wars, and shaping a dynamic economy. And then you've got Xerxes' Shadow, and this one is perhaps a bit of a wild card, which was why I've left it to the end. So do be aware that the trailer, the footage for this particular clip does have quite a bit of flashing. No idea why the developers chose it, but unfortunately this is the only footage that's available. Xerxes blends space combat, exploration, FPS, as well as fleet command all into a single game, but it kind of frames that blend in a very specific way. Here, you're piloting your fighter through dogfights, whilst also issuing real-time orders to a growing armada as you participate in the battle from your own ship. And if that works, then it's a very powerful version of the ship fantasy. It's, in principle, not too dissimilar to what we've seen in games like House of the Dying Sun, but Xerxes is taking this much, much further, as you can see from some of the very rapid footage on the screen right here. And I do wish there was a lot more footage of this, because it looks pretty interesting indeed. Not least because the cockpit is going to become a place where you're making tactical decisions under pressure, whilst also still trying to fly with your own hands. It's something that's likely going to be very hard to pull off, because hybrid games like to steal your attention away from the seat of the ship. But, you know, if this works out right, it could be one of the more interesting games that we've got here in this video. So, I think you'll notice that the common thread throughout all of these games is very much a heavy ship-centric focus. Yes, you'd imagine that space games should first and foremost be about all of this, but it turns out that's not always the case. I think it's one of the problems that Starfield had. I think as great as No Man's Sky is, it still isn't quite as heavily focused on the ship as some of these are intending to be, at least not in the same sense, not in that old traditional sense. And you know what? The reason I think these games are focusing on this, I don't think it's nostalgia. I think what's going on here is a response to what the genre itself, the space game genre, has learned over the past couple of years, or probably more than 2 years at this point, 4 or 5 years perhaps, a little bit more. And that space games actually got better at scale. They got better at activities, economy, persistence, all of those sorts of things. But a lot of them ultimately drifted away from the sensation that really made people fall in love with the idea of being in a space game to start with. And that, of course, is being the pilot of a spaceship. And the moment you then recenter your game onto the cockpit, you're really improving the immersion, you're improving the overall experience. But beyond that, you're also improving what these games can be. So let me know what you think about all of these. Which are you most excited to see, and which older cockpit games, which older spaceship games really did set your expectations and the bar for your anticipation of spaceship games and love of spaceship games in the first place? Let me know in the comment section. Take care, and I'll catch you all next time.